The Orris Project. Book 1, Origin and Earth, by David J. Salisbury. Episode 4. Chapter 2. OSA. 1.
I can't believe you're serious about this,
Brenia said. She brushed her hair out of her eyes.
This is insane. What happened to Orris?
She glared at her younger brother, tears pooling in her eyes. Garrett looked back at her with tears of his own forming.
I'm still processing it myself,
he said. His eyes dropped from hers. They stood in the kitchen of their parents' house where they grew up. Both of them visited often, as Brenia lived only a few doors down, and Garrett returned regularly for food and conversation with his parents, who shared many of the same interests as he did.
Processing?
She was getting loud.
You just told me you said yes, Garrett. What the hell do you mean you're processing? You get asked the stupidest, most insane question in your entire life, and instead of laughing at them and walking away, you say yes?
He looked up at her but did not speak.
What in all the worlds would make you say yes to that, Garrett? What would make you throw away everything you've worked for your entire life? Me? Mom and Dad? All of your friends? Everyone you've ever known? Orris? You'll never set foot on Orris. I thought that meant everything to you.
Garrett looked at his sister with wet eyes, but he did not cry, and his voice did not hitch. He spoke softly but confidently.
It did. It still does. But until today, I believed the best I could hope for was to be a division head, and in the best of cases, be on board when it left OSA's orbit for the first time, as a feeble old man.
His sister started sobbing.
When they approached me today, I thought they were going to serve me with my rejection. Instead, they talked about the migration. Then they asked me if I would consider training as an envoy. I was stunned. I stood there like an idiot, my mind spinning. Once it sunk in and I regained my senses, I couldn't say no. Saying no never even occurred to me. It's the opportunity of 1,000,000,000,000 lifetimes.
Her sobbing turned into bawling. She tried to speak during the episode, but he could not understand her. As she calmed down, she rushed toward him and clamped her arms around his waist. Her wet, swollen face pressed into the hollow of his chest. Garrett wrapped his arms around her shoulders and her mass of long brown hair. She was still talking, but it was a harsh whisper, and he could barely understand her.
You'll die.
We all die, Brenny. The only thing that matters is what we do with the time that we have here. I have the opportunity to explore other worlds and possibly even save, or at least preserve, entire civilizations of people.
She stepped back from him and pulled a tissue out of its dispenser, blew her nose, and tossed it in the waste bin.
When would you leave?
She asked. Her voice had calmed a little but still strained, and an octave higher than it would normally be.
Not until next year. There is an aggressive training program that starts next week. It will go on until a week before the launch. Then we'll have some time off to do whatever we need to before we leave.
Garrett scratched his head through his short, light brown hair. He knew the news would be harder on his sister than their parents. The plans were first announced 4 years prior, and his parents had urged him to take the exam and submit his DNA for consideration. The migration division of the Orris Project was the most difficult division to get into, as it was extremely complex and dangerous. He had agreed to apply but had done so because his goal was to get a job on Orris itself. There was a rumor that applicants to the migration division who did well but did not qualify would be fast-tracked into roles in other divisions of the project. Brenia walked back to her brother and put her arms around his waist again, and her head back on his chest, apparently choosing that position to continue the conversation. She doesn't want to look at me, Garrett thought.
How can you even survive long enough to do anything on these missions? Aren't these other planets billions of miles away?
He chuckled lightly.
No, Brenny, much farther. They assigned the first planet to us, and for me that is Dystria. It's one of the closest, but it is still 39 parsecs from OSA. That's about 750 trillion miles.
She said nothing at first, but then, in a defeated voice,
Those numbers mean nothing to me. They're too big. My real question is, how long will it take you to get there?
Garrett knew how she would react when he answered her, so he took a deep breath first and let it out slowly.
About 150 years.
He awaited her reaction, but the door to the kitchen that led out to the front porch interrupted them, swinging open. A thin, middle-aged man with still mostly black hair and the beginnings of wrinkles creeping into the corners of his eyes walked through the door. It was their father, and unfortunately for him, Brennia's focus shifted.
Did you know about this?
She shouted at him. Their father bore a look of surprise.
What are you talking about?
The two men could hear all the air rush out of Brennia's lungs. She stared at the space between them for 3 seconds, then shook her head, turned, and walked out of the room.
What the hell was that all about, Gare? What don't I know about?
Garrett walked over to the refrigerator and pulled out 2 bottles of beer. He opened both and held one out to his father. Alan Rhodes took the bottle from his son tentatively.
What's going on, Garrett?
Garrett took a long swig from his bottle and said,
The recruiters approached me today.
His father's face lit up.
Well, it had to have been good news, Gare. What did they say?
His son laughed in a way that either said you are really wrong or you are really right.
They want me to train as an envoy.
Garrett said. Alan's knees weakened. As he fell, he sidestepped, pulled out a kitchen chair in one fluid motion and sat down hard.
Envoy? I don't understand.
His father's look of puzzlement increased until it was closer to a look of disgust.
What group?
1.
Garrett said. 2. It was Alan's turn to lose his breath. He was familiar with the Migration Division's plans. At first he muttered to himself, Envoy, Group 1? He looked back up at his son and in a small voice, almost a whisper, asked,
What position?
1.
Alan's expression did not change, but the whole of his weight shifted over onto his elbow and the heavy wooden kitchen table. His eyes stared off into nothing at all. Less than 1/100% of the planet's population of 12 billion were qualified to apply for a job working on the Orris project. Of that pool of about 1 million people, the recruitment team estimated an elite subset of 700 or 800 qualified to apply for the Migration Division. The division only needed a total working team of about 90 people. Of the 90, they would select the 27 most capable as envoys. Garrett was the first one chosen. Alan was trying to embrace the fact that this meant his son was the most qualified person in the world for the most difficult job ever proposed. That was a large pill to swallow. He had always been proud of his boy, both as a child and as the man he had grown into, but a lot of fathers were proud of their children. This is on another level, Alan thought. He was not even sure what to say. Fortunately, Garrett rescued him.
I know it's a shock. I was shocked too.
I can't believe it.
Alan said, sitting back up and rubbing his head.
I mean, I can believe it, but what are the odds? You understand the gravity of them selecting you first, right?
I do.
Garrett said and shuffled his feet. Alan did not notice.
Gare, I have 1,000 questions.
Alan said, laughing nervously.
But also I can't even begin to explain the emotions. I'm so proud of you, Gare, really. I'm so excited for you, but I'm also devastated. Heartbroken. I think this is the only side of it that Brenny is going through. It's awful.
I didn't tell Brenny. She was obviously distraught, and I don't think she would have cared anyway. But OPM is going to send counselors to talk to the family.
Alan nodded. OPM was Orris Project Management, the top level of the project and the group who coordinated everything project-related. Alan leaned forward but did not get up and did not look up at his son.
It'll be like you're dead. We'll never get to talk to you again once you leave, right?
Alan asked, wringing his hands together.
No. Once I leave, I'll only be awake long enough to orbit OSA once. Then I'll go to sleep for the duration of the trip. When I wake up...
He paused.
We'll all be dead,
Alan finished.
From old age.
He sat back in his chair.
And you will wake up as though no time has passed. I can't wrap my mind around that. You'll be the same age as you were when you left.
Garrett shook his head.
They will go into a lot of detail about Sterilex and how it works in the first week of our training, so I don't have many answers now. My general understanding, though, is that no time will have passed for me.
He finished his beer and placed the bottle in the recycling bin. Alan rested his forehead on his left palm.
That's amazing. Truly it is. And this Arthur Sterrett guy is alive. Alive and well?
Arthur Sterrett was the inventor of Sterilex. After doing many small, controlled experiments with promising results on animals, He had volunteered to be the first human trial and put himself under using Sterilex for 150 years.
Yeah, he's alive. He's on the board. He's actually the board liaison for the migration division. I'm going to meet him next week,
Garrett said. Alan nodded again and stood up.
We have to tell your mother.
3. Brenia Kane laid on the couch in the living room of her parents' house, waiting for her mother to get home. She had stopped crying, and she realized she was more angry than sad. She had walked the 3 blocks from the house she shared with her husband Rodney to tell her family her news, before her brother had ruined everything with his. It only made her anger worse that she understood so little about what Garrett had signed up for. 3 years earlier, soon after the president had introduced the Orris project, OPM had announced a program that involved people permanently leaving the planet. She had paid little attention to the details, had cared little about any of it. It was not a topic talked about at the salon where she worked as a stylist. It was always a topic of conversation when she visited with her family, though. Her father was a nuclear engineer for Cormat, a private mining company. Her mother was an astrophysicist who worked for the government, specifically the Department of Defense, and then there was her brother, the prodigy since he could walk and say his first words. He was at the top of his class in everything, always. He had even skipped 2 grades in school, so he graduated the same year she did, although he was 2 years her junior. He was fit and slim, exercising regularly, and she had slowly and consistently been gaining weight in the years since they had finished school. She was the idiot in the family, the stupid hairdresser. She grew up not understanding 90% of dinner table conversations, even though her little brother would often be interested and engaged in the topics her parents were discussing. Her mother would often drop in a question to her like, "How was your day, Brenny? Learn anything interesting in school?" The questions always embarrassed her. Her mother may as well have been saying, "We know you're too stupid to understand any of this, Brenny. Is there anything you want to bore us with so you don't feel left out?" She was smart enough to see that. When she heard her mother's voice added to that of her brothers and father's in the kitchen, she stood. Unconsciously leaving her right hand on her belly, she walked around the corner to join them. 4.
So it wasn't what we expected at all.
Cynthia Rhodes was saying as her daughter walked into the room and over to a chair at the kitchen table.
Oh, Brenny, I didn't know you were here.
Brenia took a seat at the wooden table where they had all shared countless meals.
Did they tell you yet?
Brenia asked. She looked at her brother, who would not meet her gaze.
Tell me what?
Cynthia, a tall woman who wore her dyed blonde hair in short curls, looked from her husband to her son and back to her husband.
Alan?
Why don't we all have a seat? I made tea,
Alan said, and placed the teapot on the kitchen table, along with 4 teacups. They sat down, and Garrett spent the next 10 minutes laying out the details of his encounter with the recruiters. Although Cynthia Rhodes was a government-employed astrophysicist, she did not work within the Orris project and was only privy to scant details regarding it.
That's a lot to process, Garrett,
Cynthia said.
Are you sure this is something you want to do? I know your father and I encouraged you to apply for the migration division, but I think we all had a much different idea of where that application would lead, didn't you?
Garrett understood this was his mother's way of saying she did not want him to go.
I did. As I told Dad and Brenny, I was shocked when they asked me. I didn't even understand what they were asking me at first. But then the pieces fell into place, and I understood the opportunity I had available to me. I understood it would be the only time in my life that I would get an opportunity like it. I couldn't say no.
He noticed the expression change on his mother's face and could hear Brenia sob again.
I know that sounds cold.
He paused and looked at his sister, but she had her face buried in the neck of the bulky gray sweatshirt she was wearing, not able to acknowledge him.
Someone has to do this job. 27 people, actually. 27 people have to leave their families behind. I know I'm not making any of you feel better about this. I guess that's what the counselor is for. But I see this endeavor as being bigger than any one person, or even any one family. To achieve this would be...
Garrett searched for the word. When he could not find a better one, he settled for...
amazing.
Cynthia was staring at her teacup, rocking her head up and down slightly, as though in tentative agreement. She surprised both Alan and Garrett with the next question.
You will send large groups of these civilizations to Orris, or at least, that's what I understand. My question is, what will happen to you? When you finish with your missions, if you survive, where will you grow old? Where will you die?
The color drained from Garrett's face. He had not yet considered that there would be an end to the mission.
Hadn't thought about it? The way I see it, you have a few options. You could live out the rest of your life on the last planet you visit, provided it isn't destroyed because of your interference. You could join the migrants on their voyage and die on the ship. Or you could just kill yourself.
She fixed her blue eyes on her son, her face deadly serious. Garrett opened his mouth, not knowing what he would say when Brynnia spoke up.
Or you could stay here with us. Mom, Dad, me and Rodney, and the baby.
All three of them looked at her with surprise. She had a small smile growing in the corners of her mouth. Her mother jumped up to hug her.
Oh, Brenny.
Garrett stood to share a congratulatory hug with his sister. When they embraced, she whispered into his ear,
Don't leave me. Don't leave us. I don't think I could bear it.
Garrett, not wanting to make promises he could not keep but also not wanting to cause his sister any further distress, replied,
I have a lot of thinking to do.
She squeezed him tightly before letting him go. As she embraced his father, Garrett looked up at his mother, who was staring at him with no emotion.